Well, thank you very much, Dean Choche, for your kind words. Is that me? I had no idea. And thanks everybody for showing up tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here to be speaking to you. As you all know, I'm on a sabbatical and at the moment. And if anyone wondered, it's the first in 12 years. So I kind of I thought, I'll try and kind of take it seriously and try and put pen to paper. So this is not to hide. This is just to say I'm not away. I'm just thinking, and I will be back in classroom working with all of you in due course. I just joked with some people in the room that as a director of a school, you have the very, very rare occasion of giving a speech that is not about introducing people, but a true lecture, at least a welcome lecture. And this, in fact, is the first one I'm ever going to do, and probably the last one for a whole while. Because next year around, I'm going to be introducing the person, the guest of honor again. And so I'll ruthlessly exploit you being in the room and having to spend your time with me, listening to me about all things geoeconomics and public policy. What I'm going to talk about is not only close to my heart, it's also something that I've been trying to spend some time on thinking the last couple of months. And it's also something that will occupy our thinking and our time going forward. We have established here in the school a new doctoral program on deglobalization and global decoupling, which is externally funded. We have just started a new research center on geoeconomics. There's more and more people joining us on that cause. And so what I'm trying to suggest here is not everything that I'm going to tell you will be all that thought through. It's work in progress. We're thinking, and I'm trying to share some thoughts on what we're thinking about. Maybe the way to start this lecture is to share a little episode that we had last year. So it was at the beginning of term, we went to Brussels to visit the European Commission, more specifically the External Action Service, because we did a pro bono consultancy for the ambassador at large for climate diplomacy of the European Union. So the guy in charge of external climate stuff for the EU. And that was part of a capstone that we did with them. So a project group together with Brandt School students. And we tried to figure out what exactly it is that they want to achieve with the project that they had in mind, what we can do for them, what it is where we can add value for them. And that was a very good conversation. The project was all about the energy, water, human security nexus, regionally about Northern Africa. And our students eventually helped them to kind of embrace more targeted policy action in that area by way of doing away with those silos, energy, water, and human security, which is a rare thing in a bureaucracy that's built the way it is in Brussels. So all of that was great. And then on the way out, he said, but hold on, guys, just one thing I want to share. To me, this is all an exercise in geoeconomics. And here you have it. You have the climate envoy of the EU talking about human security. Okay, security, but it's human security, energy, and water. And he tells us outright that for him, this is an exercise in geoeconomics. So it's a thing. It's a thing in Brussels. It's a thing in New Delhi. It's a thing in Beijing. It's a thing in Buenos Aires. It's a thing everywhere. It's the new talk of the town. Now, it's always great to know that there's a new talk of the town, but as scholars, we need to ask ourselves, what is it that this brings to the table in terms of substance? What is it that's really new about all of this? And what does it mean for us as a discipline, but also, because we're public policy scholars, for policymakers? And that's exactly what I'm going to try and touch upon the next couple of minutes. So the first question really is there anything new about geoeconomics? And so if you ask me, I've tried to scratch my head around this a little bit. If you ask me, the way to think about geoeconomics is, at its core, is to say, look, it's all about using markets as lever of power. I think that's the one thing we can say. And that's probably where it ends in terms of people agreeing on what it is. There is no clear definition. But what we can do is we can point the finger at a couple of things that are part of geoeconomics. My list is not conclusive, it's not comprehensive, but there's a couple of things we can observe as phenomena. So what I'm doing now is mapping in the end, right? So just a classification exercise. And one of the things that I think are part of that still evolving conversation around geoeconomics is what I would label new interventionism. So that essentially, if you go back a little bit, particularly in the literature on international relations, but also international political economy, you had sways and sways and sways of studies and writings, essentially the last 25, 30 years on global governance. That was the kid in town. And global governance and that entire literature essentially declared the state literally dead. It wasn't necessarily dead, but probably on life support. And so if you think about how the governance scholarship and the global governance scholarship thought about problem solving for the sake of the argument, then it was all about orchestration of establishing ownership among key stakeholders. It was all about governing beyond the nation state, including as many actors as you can possibly get hold of, because things are complex. And the task was finding the right mix between things like nudging, incentivizing, persuasion, emulation, best practice, all these kind of things which you still learn in public policy courses. And now the state is back with a vengeance. The state and the state apparatus in its various forms and shapes, it seeks to actively intervene in markets again. It intervenes in supply chains, in production networks. And it does so with a stated goal, and that's mostly economic security, whatever that is. We can define, we can discuss later. But worse than that, states do more than that. It's not only about shaping production networks, meddling in supply chains, trying to reshape the way things are produced and flows go. It's even worse. States try and weaponize flows of goods, flows of data, even migration, if you want. That's another type of flow. And that weaponization exercise doesn't stop at technologies, digital technologies, but also finance. So there's a much more proactive way of saying, how can we use markets and economic capabilities to do things that have nothing to do with markets? And with that, you'll also get a different way of thinking about markets themselves. We shift away from free trade, and I'll come back to that point a little bit later, to what I would term strategic commerce. So markets aren't gone. Of course not. There's still pricing, there's supply, there's demand, all the rest of it. But the way markets work and trade works is different. So just to put a few pointers out there in terms of what I mean by strategic trade. Strategic trade are things where notions come in such as supply chain diplomacy. Supply chains still are there, firms take care of them, but there is some flanking out there where states and state actors try and proactively shape the ways in which those supply chains are set up or change them. Corporations, and that's less the state themselves, that's corporations as part of markets and trade, they act differently than they did a couple of years ago still. There's a lot going on in terms of vertical integration across the entire supplier value chain. Just an example, if you're a battery company today, you don't necessarily think about batteries alone. I'm talking about batteries because energy is my hobby horse. But what you think about is essentially how you can essentially, close the chain all the way down to the mine, where rare earth elements are mined, or raw materials that you need in order to build the battery that you're producing. That means graphite, lignite, lithium, manganese, whatnot. I mean, all these things going into that product. So a strong vertical corporate integration that we see as a trend. And then obviously there's a lot of flanking by the state, not only in terms of diplomacy. Sometimes that's just cheap talk. No, there is a lot of financial flanking. Sometimes it comes in the shape of de-risking. So taking some of the political risk out of private investment. Sometimes that's outright side payments in various shapes and forms. And part of all of that is strategic regulation. I'm mentioning regulation because regulation is something that public policy scholars are typically interested in. And strategic regulation has now become part of the equation in various ways. I mean, just to give you another couple of examples, think about China's local content requirements. Come and do trade with us, do business in the country, but produce a specific part of the value added in ways that it stays home. That's part of a strategic approach to regulation. I'm not saying it's wrong. It just comes with a specific purpose, and the purpose is not necessarily one informed by Ricardo. The EU does similar things. Some of you who might have a penchant for energy policy might have heard about CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. CBAM is a very strategic piece of regulation where you try and kind of not only prevent some of the emerging lead markets in, say, green steel or whatsoever at home, you also try and kind of export the model that you have in the EU based on the ETS, the carbon trading system. And this is not very benign. It is essentially about pulling a gun and say, if you want to trade with us, that's fine, but you have to do this according to our rules because otherwise you don't get access to the market. So markets are not gone, trade is not gone, but it shifts its character to something that I would call strategic commerce. And there is a final element here. I see some colleagues from economics in the room, and who naturally I would think, our dean is an economist, who would naturally think about the firm as as a business entity. And that's still absolutely right. Firms are business entities, but now there's a talk around the rise of the geoeconomic firm. And the geoeconomic firm is not really very different from firms as business entities, but there's a plus to it. The plus is essentially a very strongly political element, because what those firms do that consider themselves as actors in a more geopolitically or geoeconomically charged environment, they act as network structures, if you will, that seize opportunities from aligning or strategic alignment with state agendas. I'm not saying they stop doing what they're best at doing, but they proactively try and shape opportunity for the company by way of aligning with what the state wants. And now I'm putting one person out there that everyone has on their mind, Elon Musk, right? So Elon Musk is wonderful at creating products that people want. Until recently, at least, there's a couple of things that people wanted. Not sure Tesla is still that wanted, but the point simply is this is a great product. But the way in which, and that's not the only thing he does, but the way in which he positions himself and his companies by way of aligning his set of companies with state agendas of the US and the current government, the sitting administration. Now, there's probably something to be said about big egos being at play and all the rest of it. Okay, one thing, but the other is that this is a very strategic exercise for business development. So what I would say is many of the companies we're talking about here, founded and owned by Elon Musk, are a wonderful example of a geoeconomic firm. And there's more. Obviously, Meta, Google, all the rest of them, they come to mind. Nexperia has been talked about a lot the last couple of weeks. So it's not only big tech, there is hardware as well in terms of sectors that are involved. And all of them put a premium on exposure management. And exposure management through very selective and flexible political repositioning. So there's a strong political impetus in the ways in which they place products, develop them, but also in the ways in which they do business close to and related with the state. Now you may say, hold on, all of that rings a bell. Nothing's new here. We've been there, and you're absolutely right. Scholarly-wise, when I studied international political economy back in the 90s, that's a long time ago, I was still reading people like Gilpin. Gilpin in 1987 wrote a textbook on state-centered IPE, where he essentially says states are primary actors in the global economy driven by national interests and power, full stop. That's his definition of a state-centered international political economy. Now, again, that definition is from 1987. It simply fell out of fashion. It was never really forgotten. If you read the works of Ludwig, so late 80s, early 90s, on regulation, then Ludwig would argue that regulation has never been a value-free affair, a purpose-free affair, an interest-free affair. It always served a purpose. And the purpose that Ludwig identifies is a geoeconomic one. So people have been talking about this already. We just forgot about it for a while, also in scholarship, because also in international political economy, which is not what we're talking about today here, but just to mention, the point really was a very strong shift towards very strongly liberal approaches on how we think about the planet, the world, and what goes on it. But maybe closer to home, if you ask people from many, if not all countries from the global south, they would essentially outright deny the idea that geoeconomics ever went away. For them, globalization, so the heydays of liberalism, all the rest of it, for them, for many countries, it was an exercise of imperialism, underpinned by expansive capitalism. That was not how it was perceived in this part of the world, but for them, that was the reality. So it was a globalization, if you will, the stuff that lies behind. It was a genuinely political project, not an economic one for them, marked by things such as violence, exploitation, and driven by power and wealth-seeking behavior of industrialized countries. So for them, there's nothing new there. But there is another interesting element here. If you stay with countries that are among emerging economies and countries from the global south more generally, the way in which they think about their growth model, many of whom at least, is actually not that far away from what we would call geoeconomics in our latest talk of the town type of conversation. Because the growth model many of those countries embrace is the developmental state model. It is a model where you essentially mingle private actors and public actors for a common cause. The common cause ideally is modernization and economic development. But it relies on a mixture of industrial policy, strong state intervention, a strong financial impetus, ideally also going in things such as R&D, but very often very strong focus on infrastructure, and obviously what later on in this part of the world one would call PPPs, public-private partnerships. They were there already before we found a name for it in countries embracing the developmental state model. So this is all about intervention. This is all about steering. There the state never went away. To the contrary, it was an integral part of economic activity. And it also means that firms and private actors inevitably need to align with state agendas. And they happily did so because that was exactly how you provide opportunity for businesses and business development. So nothing here either, and nothing new here either. But there are a few things that I think are new. And again, my list is not comprehensive, and this is still a thought process. And the things that are new, I think they do matter. To state the obvious, maybe that's not so new, policy paradigms have fundamentally shifted. So the way we think about things have shifted. And ideas matter. we're going to talk about more about that in comparative and international public policy. Ideas matter. If you ask essentially what ideational underpinnings or underbelly was there during globalization, which I think is pretty much behind us, then it was probably the Ricardian idea of comparative cost advantages, specialization, welfare based on it, and all the rest of it. And that shifted ideationally to a non-cooperative competition. So Ricardo, cooperative competition, if you will, now non-cooperative. That changes a lot. Which means zero-sum games are back, not only in international politics and well, global affairs more generally. No. In markets, in the global economy, that has never been more globalized than today. But there is another, maybe more interesting element here. And I think what has also shifted and what has changed is the degree of openness. And I'm not talking about economic openness. I'm talking about openness more generally, that's in retreat, and specifically when it comes to social and cultural openness. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because something like geoeconomics as a concept, it needs to resonate with a society. It is only in very rare circumstances that political leaders can really do what they want. You have to have an outright dictatorship for that. In most cases, the complicated domestic political economy requires support. And that support is something that ideally comes from the electorate through elections, or it's indirect in more, say, authoritarian or less liberal environments. And so as a concept, a non-cooperative competitive model being embraced by leaders, for that to be embraced by leaders, there needs to be some element of agreement within society. And there need to be some strong ideational undercurrents supporting that concept. And we do see that. Various things. It involves culturally nativist ideas, political nationalism, a new penchant for illiberal strongmen, things that we now also in political science, one would call that democratic backsliding. But there's a lot more to that than just backsliding. This is a whole ideational shift that has happened essentially across the globe. This is not only something that happens here. You can start with A and start in Argentina. You go over H, and that's Hungary. What else do I have on my list? You go to R, that's Russia. India is somewhere in between, and obviously the US is an example to mention here as well. And there's a million others. I don't want to point to one specific country or the other. It is a global phenomenon, and that's an ideational shift that actually allows the broader economic agenda to change from open to non-cooperative. And a third element that I want to quickly point to is that doing away with globalization by way of embracing a geoeconomic paradigm is not about winding down or simply rewinding globalization. Globalization, and we know this from the literature, which now is a thing of the past, it has created its own dynamics and logics, its distinct features and patterns. So there's no reason to assume that deglobalization or decoupling would not create its own. It of course will. We just don't know how they look like. The world will not go back to 1985 once we wind down globalization, once we start decoupling in earnest, and that's what we're doing already. But not only economically, culturally, politically. We will see different and new logics, dynamics unfolding. And that's, by the way, exactly what we try and study in our doctoral school the next couple of years. And this crucially matters because those new logics, those new dynamics, however they look like, and we can only guess what it means and what patterns may emerge, they will have strong implications for normative goals. And those normative goals never go away. Social justice, the social ecological transition and transformation, human development, you name it. So to conclude my second point, there is something new to a lot of things that we do know, and they're worth studying as part of public policy. Now, quickly, second point, and I'm going a lot faster now because this is where I'm quite comfortable talking about. Stuff that I'm going to talk about right now, I'm not very comfortable talking about simply because we haven't done our research yet. But the next question really, and the second question is now, if all of this is a thing, what's the call on policymakers? And I guess there's a couple things we can say. One is it's a pretty tough call. I think crucially, it's first of all about broadening the scope of proactive policymaking, right? So if the purpose of public policy is to think about and take care of social justice, climate action, fairness, equity, et cetera, those normative goals, in addition to many other goals. Now, economic security comes on top of it because it is the foundation for welfare. And it now adds to everything else. Trouble is that each of those various goals, now some on top, are all on and by their own important, but they do not necessarily all pull the same direction. So you have some very tough calls to make when saying what you prioritize and what you don't. The second thing policymakers need to think about really is how to manage the negative consequences of geoeconomic fragmentation. And this is primarily about welfare loss. Welfare loss in itself, I mean, I'm not a neoliberal, but I still think Ricardo has a point. The moment you specialize and the moment you do what you do best at comparative cost advantages, everyone gains in terms of welfare. So that's the basis. The next point then is how you redistribute and try and think about the equity part of it. But fragmentation essentially means welfare loss, and that's a given. So that's something which will put a strain on societies. Dealing with that and managing the fallout will be crucial. But what comes on top of this is, because there will be fallout and because there will be a strain on society, policymakers need to think about how they ensure socioeconomic resilience. Resilience to deal with change, but also resilience to deal with loss, or maybe redistribution of welfare. And those are things that are both reactive and precautionary at the same time. So if you want to put them into a box, precautionary measures here, but some of them really, really also reactive only after the fact. Then when you establish, oh God, we got hit and we got hit hard. And a third call is what I would think about broadening the policy toolkit. So just to give you a few examples. For quite some time, social innovation may have seen as something that's desirable, but not necessarily essential. I think that has just fundamentally changed because social innovation now is a prerequisite for societal resilience. So the toolkit would probably now need to embrace ways and means and measures to enhance, facilitate, and foster social innovation a lot more than in the past. In global public policy, a little bit more my hobby horse, we need novel mechanisms to replace things that have just fallen away, like multilateral approaches to managing public goods and the global commons. There's things we can see in the making, club governance, for instance, some progressive frontrunners gathering around a cause, say decarbonizing steel, trying to do this regardless of everything else that's going on. Rather exclusive, but what we know from club governance, it works. We've been talking about climate clubs and all the rest of it. That might be a nucleus of things. There might be something to be said about establishing ties around some more normative notions. Countries, say, being democracies, trying to share efforts of friendshoring that's going on already. Companies are in fact leading the way. It's not governments, but here we were still flying quite blind, and I admit that. In short, bottom line, point to it all got a lot more complicated. And so finally, what's the call on public policy as a discipline? And with all that doom and gloom, one could say, hey, let's throw those textbooks out of the window. You know, why do we need them? And my point is, no, build on what we know. I think that's the first message I want to hammer home here. Build on what we know. Public policy is, and it will remain, the study of creating public goods and preventing public bads, full stop, period. And that's not going to change. We also do know that public policies can be created by public actors, state actors, by private actors, and social actors. And none of this will change. So, build on what we know. And we know that policymaking needs to be grounded in a value set. It's not just an exercise that lives in a vacuum. And that will also not change. You need to think about the value set, but that's also something which doesn't change. And we know, and it might even get even more urgent, we know that it is a rigorous command of methods and skills that's essential to get to the bottom of the problem and to solutions. So skills don't go away. So let's not become iconoclasts. Let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, and let's not do away with those textbooks. We've seen sea changes before, but there's probably a few things that we need to do more on and focus on more as scholars of public policy going forward. And again, no comprehensive list, just a few thoughts. The first is, I think, that we need to put a lot more emphasis on studying and understanding adaptive and experimentalist regulation. And by regulation, I don't necessarily mean only state and public regulation. There's private regulation. Again, it's not only the state that does things, right? It's public, private, and social actors that produce policies and public policy. And regulation is part of that. But the nature and the character of what we're seeing out there is changing and has to change against the backdrop of an environment that is marked by high uncertainty and rapidly changing environment conditions. There is a lot of really interesting work being done already in that domain, but I think a lot more needs to be done to understand the adaptive and experimentalist aspect of it. I think the other thing that I think requires even more attention than it did in the past is transition governance. If you were to study for an MBA, one would probably call it change management. So, and transition governance would pertain to the economy, obviously, which now finds itself in a different environment, but also society as a whole. And when I say transition governance, I don't necessarily mean a state manages a transition. It's about different types of actors managing capabilities and means for establishing resilience in order to, and venues and mechanisms in order to deal with uncertainty. And this is something that, again, has been studied in public policy, but my guess is, if I was to put my money on something, a lot of grants will come through going forward to think about that. Nonetheless, and that's maybe something I can talk about experience, I think what is required, third point, is a very comprehensive sectoral understanding. So essentially, the call on you guys is to go broad as part of the public policy degree, but at the same time, you need to go deep. You really need to know what you're talking about in your sectors, whatever you're interested in. Just an example from my hobby horse. Weaponizing energy systems sounds great, but it's not easy. It's super difficult because energy systems are super difficult. You need to have a very thorough understanding of the sector in order to understand where are levers of power, where can you use strategic regulation, and how can you possibly put to work the various toolboxes you have at hand, and also how you can counter that. So go broad, but also deep. We need good policy analysts going forward in the environment, digital domain, health, finance, conflict, welfare, energy, you name it. Pick your policy field and go deep. And I think also, and that goes back to the state, because the state is back with a vengeance. I think we need to put a lot more emphasis than we have in the past on studying of how we run the state and the changing nature of running the state. And that includes a few very obvious things, like new digital technologies that are used to run the state. But it's not only about an effective management. That's one thing. Effective management, yes, granted. States need to do this. But in environments in which resilience matters and buy-in matters, this is all about a lot more transparency, trust, but also participation. Because it is only then that the state and running the state enjoys legitimacy from the ones that are being governed, particularly in light of technologies which are quite opaque to quite a few people. Now, again, the list is not comprehensive. I will not try and kind of to put more ideas out there that probably I cannot support empirically. I trust you guys, you will develop your own penchant for one or the other policy field, or one or the other skill set. If not, we're going to push you. And while studying for a master's in public policy the coming 2 years, I know, and I go back to what Dean Chocher says, at the Brandt School, you're in good hands. Enjoy your time. And welcome all. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.